From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Of your remarks. So thank you for your time, and please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Walter Stahr.
Thanks for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be back in Washington, which was my home for so many years and where I've done so much of the research for this book. When I told taxi drivers what I was doing, that I was writing a biography of Seward, most of them had heard of Seward. They would say, oh yeah, he bought Alaska. And that's right. But what else did he do? What was he like? Let me take that last question first. What was he like as a person? During the Civil War years, Seward was in his early 60s, short, lean man with a mass of sort of disorderly gray hair, big nose, almost always a cigar in his mouth, and if it was any time past 5 in the evening, a glass of wine was near at hand. Talking, always talking. One of his guests at a dinner party said that it was like being a shingle under the Niagara Falls to sit and participate in one of his dinner parties. Worked very hard late at night, but also lived and was a famous host, gathering around his table diplomats, soldiers, politicians, actors, the life of the party. So what did he do? Well, he was Secretary of State for 8 years under Lincoln and then under President Johnson. Before that, he was a federal senator for 12 years, and before that, he was governor of New York. Maybe I should start there. He was governor of New York in the late 1830s, early 1840s, when New York was by far our most populous state. He was a progressive, even a visionary governor. One of his main causes as governor was education, particularly the education of Irish Catholic children in New York City. Many of those children weren't going to school at all because the public schools used Protestant texts and thus weren't acceptable to Catholic parents. Seward was determined to see all children educated regardless of religion. And I should mention here on this stage that he was also a big fan of libraries and believed that extending public libraries in New York would change the world as New Yorkers read books and then went out into the world. He was keen on transportation. He wanted the state to build canals and railroads, not just for economic reasons, but to bind the state and the nation together more closely. And he made himself famous in the North and infamous in the South when he refused a request from the governor of Virginia that he return 3 men accused of helping a slave to escape. There was no law of New York, Seward declared, that made it a crime to help a man escape from slavery. After a brief period working as a lawyer, Seward was elected senator, came here to Washington. His most famous speech as senator was in 1850, arguing against what we know as the Compromise of 1850. He was especially against the idea that any part of the recently acquired territory in the West would become slave territory. A higher law than the Constitution, Seward declared, dedicated that Western territory to freedom. And he soon became known as Higher Law Seward. By early 1860, Seward was the odds-on favorite to become the Republican nominee for president. The first ballot at the Chicago Convention in May of that year, Seward had by far more votes than any other candidate. He was within striking distance of the nomination. But then the delegates surprised almost everyone, including Seward, by nominating the almost unknown one-term congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Seward was in his garden with a few friends when this happened, And he knew that it had happened even before he read the telegram, because the man running from the telegraph office had a piece of paper in his hand, waving it as he ran towards Seward, yelling, oh God, it's all gone, gone. Abraham Lincoln has the nomination." Why? What happened? Well, it's in chapter 7, but a brief version is that some of what Seward had said and done over the years came back to haunt him. If I had to name one factor that prevented him from getting the Republican nomination, it was what he had done for those Catholic school children in New York City a decade before. Thaddeus Stevens, whom some of you may remember from the recent Lincoln movie, said that his state, Pennsylvania, would never vote for a man who had ruined the public school system of New York City to curry favor with Catholics and foreigners. There was an anti-immigrant strain in the Republican Party even back in 1860. Seward was disappointed, but he mastered his disappointment and then went out on the campaign trail for his rival, Abraham Lincoln. He campaigned from Maine to Minnesota, from New York City all the way out to the prairies of Kansas. No man did more to secure the election of Abraham Lincoln than Seward. And it was in part because of this that Lincoln named Seward his Secretary of State. There was also a tradition in the 19th century. Presidents often named the man they thought should be their successor as Secretary of State. Think Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams. All of those men had served as Secretary of State before becoming president. And so by naming Seward as Secretary of State, Lincoln was really tapping him as his most likely successor. That winter, the secession winter, as southern states started to secede, Seward was the leading advocate of compromise here in Washington. In January 1861, in a packed Senate chamber, he stood up and gave a speech. The first part of it was closely based on the words of my man, John Jay. He talked about how disastrous it would be for the United States to divide into two or more nations. And then he went on to talk about the compromises that he would be prepared to make in order to keep the South together. Up to and through and after the inauguration of Lincoln, Seward continued to pursue compromise. He thought that with just a little more time, a Union Party would begin to emerge in the southern states, and one by one, those states would begin to come back into the Union rather than leaving. And so he opposed the effort to reinforce Fort Sumter. He predicted rightly that it would lead to a civil war. Once the war started, his main task was keeping Britain and France from siding with the South and supporting it. He knew his history. He knew that the critical moment back in the American Revolution was when France recognized and pledged military support to the nascent United States. If Britain did the same with the Confederacy, the game was up. In some form, the Confederacy would survive. So that was his first task, to prevent that. And he succeeded, and in a way, his success leads us to forget that he accomplished that. But Seward didn't limit himself to diplomacy. My man was not a man who could limit himself in any way. He helped with recruiting. He gave political speeches. He advised Lincoln on military matters. He was Lincoln's closest counselor and friend during the war. His cabinet colleagues, notably Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, complained that on important issues, there was only one man with whom Lincoln spoke, William Henry Seward. And it was in part because of his important role as deputy president, if you will, that John Wilkes Booth targeted Seward for assassination on the night in April 1865 that he killed Lincoln. Seward was in some respects a very easy target that night. He'd been injured in a carriage accident 2 weeks prior. He was confined to his bed, immobile. So the assassins knew exactly where to find him. and the assassin managed to get into Seward's bedroom. He had a pistol in one hand and an 8-inch Bowie knife, now in the collections of the Huntington in California, in the other. The pistol wasn't working because he'd already used that to club Seward's son, Frederick, nearly to death outside Seward's door. But the knife was in very good working order. He pressed Seward down on his bed with one hand and with the other slashed for Seward's face and neck. In one sense, he missed. He didn't sever the arteries. But in another sense, he succeeded quite well. When you see the pictures of Seward after the assassination attempt, he was horribly disfigured and bled copiously that night. The doctors thought he would die. He didn't. He survived. He was back at his desk, indeed, at the State Department within a couple of weeks. And he continued to serve as our Secretary of State through the controversial administration of President Andrew Johnson. It was during that period that he purchased Alaska for $7.2 million in gold. Now, almost all of you know that when he purchased Alaska, he was mocked and that it was called Seward's Folly. I'm here to tell you it's a myth. I've read dozens, maybe hundreds of newspapers from that time period after the treaty was signed and while it was pending in the Senate, and the coverage is almost entirely favorable. And the Senate ratified the treaty with only 2 dissenting votes. Then and now, senators don't vote for things that people are mocking as folly. No, the folly point emerges a few months and years later as it becomes clear that Seward doesn't have his eyes merely on Alaska, but that he wants to get British Columbia and Hawaii and the Panama Canal and, the Virgin Islands. He signed a treaty to purchase those. The Hartford Courant wrote that Seward would, quote, buy up the whole hemisphere, from the glaciers of Greenland to the volcanoes of Tierra del Fuego, if only he lives long enough and the credit of the nation holds out. Now, none of those purchases came to pass during Seward's tenure or indeed during his lifetime, but some of them, as we know, did come to pass, and some of them were accomplished by Seward's protégés years later. I'd like to close my remarks and then take your questions with a quote from a speech that Seward gave here in Washington in July of 1863, his house just up the way there, Lafayette Square. It's not long after Gettysburg, and I think the mood in Washington was not unlike the mood in September of 2001. The Capitol had survived an attack, but it was apprehensive about another. And Seward said that whatever happened, he was determined to remain on duty here. Quote, if I fall here, let no kinsman or friend remove my dust to a more hospitable grave. Let it be buried under the pavements of the avenue, and let the chariot wheels of those who have destroyed the liberties of my country rattle over my bones, until a more heroic and worthy generation shall recall that country to life, liberty, and independence. That was his resolution, he said. Now, fellow citizens, for yours. They must resolve that they would not wait for, quote, draft or conscription. Ask not whether the enemy is near or whether he is far off. Ask only, is there an enemy still in arms against the United States? And array yourselves to meet that enemy. And then, looking at the American flags that were over his head and around the square, he said that the American flag must not wave only here in the nation's capital. It must wave throughout the country until, quote, not one disloyal citizen remains in arms to oppose it. Thank you. Yes?
Good morning. Enjoyed your book immensely. It was a very good read. And as also a son of Eastern Ohio, I hope your next book is on Secretary Stanton.
I'm deeply into Secretary Stanton right now.
Very good. Question I had was, in reading your book, I really felt that he had a great sense of timing as to what may need done in terms of compromise, especially during the secession winter. But the one thing that struck me was when he proposed to Lincoln about the potential for creating a war with Great Britain, for bringing the country back together. Was this just grasping at straws? Was this that something that he thought would really work, considering how divided the country really was at that point?
Okay. So the question was, when in the secession winter, when Seward proposes to Lincoln that we try to gin up a foreign war, was that grasping at straws, or was there some reality to it? I'll admit that when I first tackled this, I wanted to be able to say that it was an idea that he had on one day and forgot about on the next, but I kept finding hints of this in various things, in speech that he gave in December and in reports coming back from Washington to foreign capitals. Now, as he looked at the situation, he thought that in an effort to save the Union, maybe not a war itself, but a war scare, to sort of rally people around the flag would be a possible way, maybe not of bringing South Carolina back into the Union, but of preventing, let's say, Virginia or North Carolina from leaving the Union. Given a choice between standing by the old flag and defending it against those terrible British and fighting a North-South war, he thought that the border states would want to stand by the old flag. So, all right. Yes.
Good afternoon. I have a question as far as Secretary Seward advising Lincoln on the prosecution of the war. Was he one of the people who believed in the hard war, or was he one of the people who wanted to negotiate with the South and bring the war to an end, somewhere around 1863 or 1864? Did he agree, with the way Grant prosecuted the war? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, so is he a hard war man, or is he a compromise with the South? In a sense, he's both. There's never a point at which Seward dissents from the hard techniques that are being used. And indeed, he's at the forefront. In the first year of the war, he's responsible for what we would call domestic security. He's the man who throws people into jail and leaves them there until he's good and ready to let them out. And yet, throughout the war, just as in the secession winter, he's keen to find a compromise. Throughout the war, in his speeches, he talks about how soon, the South will come back. In one of his speeches, he analogizes the states to stars of a constellation. And he says that just as stars in a constellation are attracted by gravity, the states have a natural gravity, and they will come back together. And most notably, it's Seward whom Lincoln sends in January of 1865 south to meet the three Confederates at what we call the Hampton Roads Conference. Lincoln comes along as sort of an afterthought, so there are actually 5 men. And Seward is very keen, if possible, at that juncture to find a negotiated resolution with the South. And because of that, there are people here in Washington, his friend Charles Sumner, for example, who think Seward is too keen to negotiate. Sumner writes to a friend that in 1863 that we're too successful because he fears that the war will be won and that Seward will let the southern states back in with slavery. And for Sumner, that's intolerable. So, yes, over here.
Yes. As you pointed out, in 1850, Seward was brilliant and eloquent in opposing the Compromise of 1850 in terms that really speak to us today. I mean, he sounds like a man living in the 20th century when speaking to people who are living in the 19th, and he's by far the least willing to compromise in the Senate. As I think you also point out in your book, his wife is harboring fugitive slaves in their home in Auburn, New York. He's a fierce anti-slavery man. Can you say something about how he personally and morally evolved to the point where in 1860 he is so ready to compromise with the slaveholding South?
Yes, Seward on slavery definitely evolves over time. He does harbor fugitive slaves in his home, which is really quite remarkable for a man with presidential ambitions to commit a federal felony and risk his entire political career. And yet, by 1860, he's ready to think about compromises with slavery in the South. Indeed, in 1860, he proposes a constitutional amendment to declare that Congress has no authority to interfere with slavery in the southern states. And during the war, Seward, in my view, is actually reluctant to endorse the Emancipation Proclamation, and after the war is largely unconcerned about the fate of the southern slaves. So, and is highly criticized, people saying that he earned honor by thinking of the slaves earlier in his career and now earns dishonor. That's the New York Independent. He's concerned about slavery, but for him, the Union is more important. So in this sense, he's not unlike Daniel Webster's famous speech in the Compromise of 1850, where he says, he comes to speak not as a Northern man, but as a United States senator representing the whole nation. And Seward, particularly after the war, is keenly concerned to knit the southern states back into the Union. And if that means that the former slaves suffer for another decade, so be it, is his view.
Hello. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, suggests that Seward thought he was going to be more like a prime minister, maybe a bit of the power behind the throne kind of thing, but that fairly early on he sees the greatness in Lincoln and his leadership, and so he shifts. If you agree with that, what does that say about Seward, that he's willing to kind of shift and see that? And then quickly, what did you think of the portrayal of him in the movie Lincoln?
Okay. I basically agree with what Dora says, that, there's no question that Seward comes into power in the State Department thinking that he's going to be, as some prior Secretary of States had been, half in charge. And Lincoln disabuses him of that notion, and Seward comes round and realizes Lincoln's virtues and works faithfully for him. And for me, the more important thing is not that initial tension. It's the 4 years of faithful service and friendship. That one memo suggesting a war, well, we've all written an email we regret. But Seward is right there at Lincoln's side throughout the war. The portrayal in the movie of Seward, how to put it, when you spend all your time in the primary sources, when you see a movie, you're always going to see a few little things here and there. But in general, I like the Seward in the movie. I love the incidents with the cigar and the glass of wine. I think that's pretty close to what he was like. That he was, I only regret that the movie didn't have time to sort of take us to Seward's house and show him in social settings. And certainly the sort of the mover and shaker, the man who knew how to get things done on Capitol Hill that's portrayed in the movie, that's my man. It's not an accident that Lincoln turned to Seward to get the 13th Amendment through Congress. It's not an accident that he got it done. And what the movie unfortunately doesn't portray, but we should think about, is that if Lincoln and Seward had not accomplished that at that juncture, it wouldn't have happened for years and years, because Andrew Johnson wasn't going to lift a finger to get the anti-slavery amendment through Congress. So on this side.
Religiously and philosophically, how diverse was this cabinet of Lincolns, and particularly personally with Abraham Lincoln, how much did they share and interact on such weighty matters?
Religiously and philosophically, how diverse? Well, Seward was an Episcopalian. Lincoln, a little harder to say. There's a great joke. Lincoln's headed out in a carriage here, and the road is bad, and the carriage driver is swearing up a storm, and Lincoln says, "My friend, are you an Episcopalian?" And the carriage driver says, "No, I guess I was raised as a Baptist." And Lincoln says, "Oh, well, you're swearing just like Secretary Seward, and he's a firm Episcopalian." Thanks to Noah Brooks, the newspaper reporter, for that one. I really am not sure that they talked a lot about religious issues other than as they bore on the war. Seward shared Lincoln's sense that this was not just something, a war between men, that this involved God in some way, and he puzzled over how God was involved. But whether he and Lincoln actually sort of talked about those issues or just were thinking about them simultaneously, I don't have any proof. So on this side.
Hello, this is kind of a follow-up to the last question on this side. Is it accurate that Seward very early in the administration, or maybe even before, wrote Lincoln a letter in which he proposed that he essentially make all the big decisions and Lincoln would carry them out?
Yes, that is the famous April 1st memorandum. The original's up there in the Library of Congress in the manuscript room. And you can see it for yourself on the online version of the Lincoln Papers. Seward writes a note saying, look, it's been a month. We've spent all of our time dealing with who's going to be the postmaster in Chicago, and we haven't really developed a domestic policy or a foreign policy. On the domestic front, Seward wants to give up Fort Sumter and try to use that as a way of making Lincoln the Union president. And on the foreign front, he raises, as the person mentioned, the possibility of war, or at least the threat of war with Britain or France. And then at the end, I don't have the precise wording, it's sort of convoluted, as his sentences often were, but he said something to the effect of, whatever is decided, someone must be in charge of seeing that it is done. Either the president or some member of the cabinet. I don't mean to suggest myself, but I'm not shirking the matter either. And Lincoln writes out a response, which is not among the Seward papers in Rochester. It's in Lincoln's papers, so in all likelihood, he didn't give it to Seward. He just talked about it. And at the end, when he got to that question of personnel, Lincoln said, as to that, I must do it. And that's the quote in the heading of my chapter that deals with it. But again, although this memo is interesting, I think to spend too much time on it distorts the relationship between Lincoln and Seward. It sort of focuses on one moment of tension rather than 4 years of friendship and collaboration. So, yes, on this side.
Question about maybe the not-so-glorious part of Seward, his relationship with Lincoln's successor, perhaps the worst president in the history of the country. Comment on that?
Yes, Andrew Johnson. When I started this research, I was keen to say that from the moment Lincoln died, Seward ceased to be involved in domestic politics, that he was only focusing on foreign affairs, and then I'd be able to talk about Alaska and British Columbia and all sorts of other nice issues. But as I did the research, it became very clear that Seward continued to be intimately involved in domestic policy, and in particular in Johnson's Reconstruction policies. There's a great image, a Condé Nast cartoon. It shows Johnson as a Roman emperor, and he's sitting in the amphitheater, and down in the floor of the amphitheater, whites are slaughtering blacks. Johnson doesn't look very concerned. And who's the evil advisor leaning over Johnson's shoulder and whispering in his ear, giving him ideas about policy? It's Seward. And it's true. Seward agreed with Johnson's Reconstruction policies. He thought the most important thing was to bring the states back together, to have representation of the South in the Congress. And he was not especially troubled by the fact that there was some white-on-black violence going on, by the fact that blacks couldn't vote. So it's not the greatest chapter in his history, but it's there. Yes?
Following up on the Hampton Roads Conference in, I think, February of 1865, what on earth could Seward concede to the South? The war was virtually won. I've never seen the purpose of that conference, because what could the North give in on at that point?
Well, there is some suggestion. It's in Southern sources, and so this is controversial, but there is some suggestion that Seward said to the 3 Southern delegates, look, lay down your arms, rejoin the Union, and then your votes will be able to prevent the 13th Amendment from becoming part of the Constitution. Think about that. He had just spent the month of January in an all-out lobbying effort to get the amendment passed by the House of Representatives. He goes down to Hampton Roads and basically offers the constitutional amendment ending slavery up as a bargaining chip to the Southern delegates. So I think, his position at that point was basically akin to that of Lincoln. The Union has won. Slavery ended, although Seward may be soft on that point, and everything else up for negotiation, including points such as whether the federal government would take on some of the Confederate war debt, how quickly and on what terms the Southerners would come back into political power in their own states. So there were things that the South cared about that Lincoln and Seward could have offered them. But at that point, the Southerners believed that they were still going to be able to establish their own state, and they weren't willing to negotiate on that first and most basic point.
Thank you.
Am I really through with questions here before? All right. Well, I will ask a question that nobody's asked, but somebody should ask, which is, tell us a bit about his wife and his family. All right. His wife, Frances Seward, they married quite young. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer in Auburn, and is in a way a kind of curious and contradictory figure. On the one hand, she's much more ardently anti-slavery and to some extent pro-women's rights than her husband. One of the things I discovered was that among her close personal friends were the women who organized the Seneca Falls Convention, at which they declared that all men and women are created equal. And Frances Seward, those were some of her very best friends. But on the slavery issue, to take an example, in the summer of '62, when Lincoln is thinking about an Emancipation Proclamation, and there's a lot of public pressure on him both to issue an Emancipation Proclamation or not to issue it, Frances writes to her husband saying that he owes it to himself and to his family and to his country and to his God to see that the president does the right thing. And if he won't do the right thing, he should resign rather than by remaining in office to give countenance to a great moral evil. Seward writes back and says, no, proclamations are paper. We're going to win the war with the army. So this is an issue upon which they disagree violently. But what's curious is that this political woman with such strong views is not here in Washington. Indeed, that's how we know that they had this disagreement. She's back home in Auburn, New York, where she remains for almost the entire war. And she's not just in Auburn, she's generally in her bedroom with the blinds closed. She was often ill, and I think many of her illnesses were psychological and hypochondriac. And so, although they loved one another and he respected and listened to her, they weren't often together. He was off in Albany or Washington or traveling around the world, and she was at home in Auburn, where she liked it. She did come to Washington after the carriage accident that I mentioned to tend to her husband, and so she was here on the night that the assassin came into her house, nearly killed her husband, nearly killed her son, stabbed several other people for good measure. And she tended to her husband and her son lovingly until they were back on the road to health. And then within roughly a month of the assassination attempt, she passed away. It was too much for her. So sadly, Seward lives the last few years of his life without his beloved wife. And more sadly, his daughter Fanny, whose diary, wonderful diary, provides us with much of what we know about that night, passed away of tuberculosis roughly a year later. So a loving family man, but a curious family, and a family often divided by distance. So, yes?
Hi, I was wondering, in Albany, New York, there's a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation edited in part by Seward with his comments between the lines in Lincoln's hand. I wonder if you believe he's had enough credit over the years for some of Lincoln's work as Lincoln's editor.
So the question was, Seward as Lincoln's editor of the first inaugural address, of the Emancipation Proclamation, has he gotten enough credit? Well, as his biographer, he can never get enough credit. But I think in general that historians have, they've noticed the little instances in which Seward's handwriting is on Lincoln's work and given him his due. They were two lawyers, and they respected one another as lawyers, as wordsmiths. And so Seward often would pass drafts of his messages to the foreign ministers or his political speeches to Lincoln for his comments. And Lincoln, vice versa, would rely on Seward as sort of a sounding board and speechwriter on some of his more important speeches. So on this side.
Can you tell us a little about your research process and how long it takes you to come up with your book?
This book took about 5 years from kind of conception to publication. And my research process, I start with a document that I call a bibliography. It's not really a bibliography yet because I haven't looked at anything, but I start by figuring out what books I need to look at and what manuscript sources and what newspapers I'm going to need to look at to write the book. And then as I read, I take notes and organize those in chronological form. So for Stanton at the moment, I have about 900 pages of chronology, sort of the day by day of the life of Edwin Stanton. And at some point, I'm going to put that on one side of my desk and a few other things off nearby, and I'm going to start trying to turn that into a life of Edwin Stanton. So that's a very short version of how I do the research.
How would you compare Seward's role as the indispensable man to Lincoln to Hamilton's role to George Washington?
One of the things I love about coming and doing these things is you get questions you never thought about before. Well, there were some similarities and some differences. So some of the similarities, I think it is true that Washington relied very heavily on Hamilton's clever pen to write things for him, and he came to trust in Hamilton's political judgment, although I don't know that there was ever a moment in which Washington sort of put himself quite as much in Hamilton's hands as some of Hamilton's later critics have said. Some differences, though. There was a huge gap in ages and position between Washington and Hamilton when the two men first meet. Seward and Lincoln are much more on a par. Indeed, if anything, Seward is far better known and more experienced in Washington and the world than Lincoln when they arrive in Washington, or when Lincoln arrives in Washington as president-elect. And so there's more of a parity, and from that parity emerges, I think, more of a personal friendship than Washington and Hamilton ever had. I'm not sure that anyone ever really was a friend of George Washington. I think he was just already sort of on a pedestal that made that difficult. So one more.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. I'll have to read the book. Would you care to speculate on what a Seward presidency would have looked like had he gotten the nomination in 1860?
So the question is, what would Seward have been like as president if he'd gotten the nomination? First of all, I'm not sure that he would have been elected. I originally thought he would have, and then the more time I spent thinking about his problems, and in particular the anti-Catholic sentiment, I'm not sure Seward would have been able to win all the states that Lincoln did. But let's assume he did. I think that the place that it's clearest that they would have diverged is in the secession winter. Seward would not have sent that ship to Fort Sumter that was fired upon that led to the start of the Civil War. I think there would have been a Civil War, however, over that or some other flashpoint, and I think he would have conducted the war more or less as Lincoln did. I doubt he would have issued an Emancipation Proclamation, but we would have gotten to the same point. Seward's opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation was, hey, we're going to get there without a piece of paper. The armies are going to conquer the South. As they do, the slaves will free themselves. Why risk the political consequences of a proclamation? So there would have been some differences. The speeches would not be carved in marble here on the Mall. Thanks so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.